Welcome to the Pioneers in Pixels audio podcast, hosted by Sanjay K. Katarpal, CEO of Marketing Markers, a digital marketing agency. Here we have discussions with some of the leading attorneys. Disclaimer: the podcast is for educational purposes. Please reach out to attorneys for legal advice.
Hey, Peter. How are you?
Hey, Sanjay. Good morning. How you doing?
Doing great. Thank you for joining. And before I start the details of it, just wanted to understand or give me some background about who you are, how you got into this one, what your niches are, things like that. Just trying to understand your story about you, from you. Go ahead.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, first, thanks for having me. So my background, I started my education, I'll say, in undergrad, focusing on business. I always knew I wanted to do something in the business world. So I graduated my undergrad with a marketing and management double major. And I wanted to stay somewhere, somehow in the business world. So when I went to law school, from a education perspective, you get a very broad education in law school. Certainly in the first 2 years, the third year, you start to specialize or focus or concentrate on a particular area. And that's when I focused on the corporate law side of things. And so when I graduated law school in 1996, so I've been practicing almost 30 years now, graduated law school in 1996. I knew I wanted to do something in the corporate field. I actually started at a small firm first in Long Island, for a very short period of time, and then to Manhattan for a period of time, a few years. And on the Manhattan firm perspective, it was a small firm that had a corporate law concentration, but did everything. And I think the do everything aspect, and I'll start there, the do everything aspect was a great way for a young lawyer to gain a foundation of law. We have attorneys in my firm who specialize in everything, but they don't necessarily have the foundation across the system, so to speak. When I started, I did everything that walked through the door. So I wanted to do corporate law. I did corporate law, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But I also did a little of everything else. Everything else means real estate focused. It means matrimonial focused. It means litigation focused. It means criminal work. It means trust and estates. Point being is that I have a very broad foundation, and I can talk intelligently with clients, not just on corporate law perspective, but across the board. But that being said, those years in Manhattan, was ultimately on a corporate law focus. Did that for a number of years, and about 24 years or so ago, I came to Woodbridge, which is where I am now. So I'm with the firm of Wilentz, Goldman and Spitzer. From a firm perspective, we're one of the bigger firms in New Jersey. And as I mentioned a moment ago, everybody specializes in our firm in something. My specialization is corporate and healthcare law. So it's kind of a dual focus. I got into or came in with the corporate specialty, and clients that we were servicing happened to be more and more in those early years in the healthcare field. Doctors, hospitals, surgery centers, chiropractors, dentists. And so not only was I doing the broad corporate representation of manufacturers and service companies, retailers, et cetera, but also separately getting into the healthcare world, which is a very specialized field and very small in terms of the number of attorneys in New Jersey who practice. It's a very specialized field. So long story short, my practice now is both general corporate counseling and specifically corporate counseling to those in the healthcare space. And I think one of or two of the things that make me fairly unique is, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think I've got that great foundation of legal skills across the whole spectrum. So I can talk intelligently, not only in terms of what I focus on, but, across the whole breadth of legal topics. And I had in the past small firm experience. And so I can relate both to the large clients and the small clients. I understand where the small clients come from and what their perspective is and what their focuses are. And likewise, from the big client perspective, I can navigate what they focus on. And sometimes there's a lot of intersections, and sometimes it's two different things that, well, it might be the same ultimate task, but different focuses. So that's the quick summary of where I am and how I got here today. And so my general practice right now is counseling, like I said, corporate clients in all industries, and a good chunk of them in the healthcare field.
Interesting. So both, like, you are in the corporate and health both, and like kind of joining them in hands also, like corporate healthcare too.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, and then I'll mention some later on, but there's a lot of overlap and a lot of differences.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's pick up the corporate angle first, and I'm saying that what I understand from what you said is like, we're dealing with the businesses, could be any size of structure, private, public, family owned kind of thing, because you have a small firm experience on this thing. And you said that probably full range of business matters and transactions you do it. So give me a little bit more in depth here, like what kind of transactions in the business matter you kind of prefer to do it, or you're doing it, or specialize in doing it, something on those lines on the corporate law stuff part of it. Yeah,
sure. So from a corporate perspective, I generally say I do anything with a contract. And so broadly, it's transactional services and general counseling. So let me talk about the general counseling first. I'm oftentimes a sounding board from a business perspective of businesses calling me up and asking either for my input or ideas from a business perspective. And it's day-to-day stuff. Hey, I'm thinking about hiring somebody. What should I be thinking about?
Okay.
Hey, I'm thinking about entering into a new service line. What should I be thinking about? I'm thinking about letting somebody go. What should I be thinking about? So a lot of times it is, I'll say, counseling and giving advice, sometimes not legally, but from a legal and quasi-business perspective. And so just the day-to-day counseling and things that come up in the day-to-day activities of a business owner. But more specifically, what I really do touch upon every day is contracts and some form of contracts. And they fall into, various types of buckets. So the first is buying and selling. And investing. One of my specialties is what we call mergers and acquisitions. You have a business owner that wants to sell. You have a business owner that wants to buy another business, or you have an individual who wants to invest in a business. That kind of goes in the broad bucket of M&A, as we call it, mergers and acquisitions. And so I will help navigate through that process. It's just using the example of selling a business. Client would come to me and say, I'm looking to sell a business. Oftentimes they have a buyer already targeted, and that's when I get involved, and we'll go through the process from step one, which is that first conversation, right to the end, which is, closing the deal. Transferring ownership, transferring money, but there's a long process in between.
Yeah.
If you're a business owner looking to buy a business, you don't wake up tomorrow and say, I want to sell next month, but rather you should be getting things in line months, if not year plus in advance. You want to make sure your financial financial statements are in good shape. So I'd work with the accountant to make sure from a financial perspective, everything is clean. Because the first thing a buyer is going to ask for is to see financial statements and tax returns.
One point I just want to interject, and thanks for letting me interrupt you. So you actually, before these clients or somebody come back and say, listen, I want to sell my business, you are doing a business valuation yourself, or you are kind of, hey, come back with a business valuation, because business valuation is the first step. You're going to just get up and say, I want $2 million for the business. Well, you got to work for 2 years to actually bring you to a point. Your business is worth that, but not yet. So work. That's what you're talking about, really, that
yeah,
to find out your worth also.
So good question. No, I don't do business valuations in the sense that I don't go to a client and say your business is worth X amount of dollars.
Okay.
There are folks who specialize in that. However, what I do is work with those folks. It could be a business valuation, it could be an accountant, but I do work with those folks and the business owner, and we put together a package of discussion points in terms of how to make the business most attractive from a seller's perspective, or really from a buyer's perspective, but how to position the seller to make it most attractive. That's cleaning up its financial statements, and it's touching on non-financial stuff as well. For example, if you are a buyer of a service business, for example, part of what you're buying is relationships with clients. And the tighter the relationships, or the more clear those relationships are in contracts, customer contracts, the more attractive that business becomes to a buyer. If you've got books and contracts that are a mess, that are spread out all over the place, that don't make sense, a buyer could have a little reluctance on moving forward. If you have tight contracts with customers, good contracts, clear contracts, same thing could be said for employees. All of the internal operational items, the cleaner it is, the tighter it is, the better the presentation to a buyer can be, because from a seller's perspective, you're trying to maximize the value. So the more attractive it is, the more value you can get. So that's how I would do it. I'd be working with the team, so to speak, to get it as attractive as possible.
Interesting. So again, I'm just going to go back and say, you said that you work for the small firm. So any specific business sector, so you have worked with all of them, and you're okay to work with that. But since you have grown up from being a small company or a law firm you're working for, come to realize there, is there a specific sector you guys work with as a company, as a law firm? Or you still go with all the sectors and say, I'm fine with any sector as long as you are doing something like this?
So I would start off by saying it's any segment, any sector, any service line. However, yes, there are ones that come to my plate more often than others. Anything in the healthcare field, I do a significant amount of work with. Anybody in the tech field, the IT field, the software field, do a lot of work with. So those, in some level, are what I do more with. But that's certainly not the end. I have many restaurant clients. I have many accounting and law firm clients. I have many chemical and product manufacturing clients. So it does touch upon everything. But I would say that the healthcare and the IT spaces are probably the numbers 1 and 2 on the list.
Interesting. So it is from the business conceptualization point of view till like somebody's trying to hey, I want to expand my business, and I want to make this as a franchise, or I want to buy a franchise, or I just want to buy some other 4 businesses. All of that is covered, or is that a true statement in a way?
Yeah, so I would do. So I've raised the buy and sell of business perspective, but yes, it's many things beyond that. Let me give you some 4 examples.
Yeah, it'll be helpful. Yeah.
What we call partnerships agreements in very broad stroke, but that falls under operating agreements, shareholder agreements. But it's the governing document among business owners. If you own a business with others, whether it's 2 of you, 3 of you, 10 of you, 20 of you, whatever the number of owners are, if it's more than one, a sole owner, if it's more than one, you should have some sort of governing document that governs the relationship.
Right.
And again, I just use the broad stroke title of partnership agreements because that's what everybody hears and is familiar with. What does that agreement cover? It basically lays out the rules of the business. If you have two owners, for example, the ideal, it's not a legal requirement, but rather it is a good business requirement to say the two of you as business owners should have a partnership in place, a partnership agreement in place, and should have that partnership agreement in place at the inception of your relationship. What that agreement will cover is a bunch of broad categories, but it basically lays the foundation for the rules. Number one, very simple items. Who are the owners and what are the ownership percentages? And I've had many clients come to me after the fact where sometimes they've been in business with somebody for a long period of time and cannot tell me who the owners are or cannot tell me what each owns in terms of percentages. So you'd be surprised what people don't focus on, but should be focusing on. But in any event, the partnership agreement governs who owns and what the percentages are. From that, many topics. Number one is economics. What's the money going out and entitlements to that? Meaning, if there's profits, how are profits split? If one or more folks do services on behalf of the business, do they pull some sort of salary off the top in addition to their share of the profits? And then on the flip side, is there an obligation of some sorts to put money into the business if from time to time cash flow is slow and, there's still expenses that need to be paid, but if cash flow is slow. So what are the obligations on the money in perspective?
Yeah.
So that's another thing that these partnership agreements govern. The third thing is decision making. I always use the example to clients. You can own 99% of a business and have 0% of vote. You could own 1% of a business and have 100% of the vote. Okay. There's no right or wrong answer, and it's a function of what the owners want. But point is what's the voting mechanics? What are the voting structure? Who makes decisions? What's the percentages? Things like that. And then tied to that as well is, from an expectation perspective, is anybody, required to put any time into the business? Just because you are a business owner does not mean you have to work full time or any time.
Yeah.
Ownership and responsibility in terms of doing day-to-day stuff, one has nothing to do with the other. So you want to know at the beginning what is expected of you and what is expected of the other owners in terms of commitment, timing, day-to-day stuff, that type of thing. And then I'll say the last, sort of broad stroke category is the what if in terms of separation. Not that you want to be thinking of the end at the beginning, but you should at least think about it. What happens if somebody wants out? What happens if somebody wants to leave? What happens if somebody wants to retire? What happens if the parties just don't get along? What are the mechanics for separating the business?
It makes sense.
Yeah. And what I always say, for example, a common one is if somebody passes away. I always use the example of a car or a pen. If you own a car or a pen and you pass away, it goes to the estate. It doesn't go to somebody else. Nobody can come in and say, I want that car, I want that pen. Rather, it goes to the estate, and whatever the estate rules are, that's where it goes. Same thing can be said about your ownership percentage. If you own 50%, if you own 25%, whatever it is, if you pass away, well, your ownership goes to your estate, your spouse, your kids, whomever's designated in your will, etc. A lot of times, business owners don't want to be in business with somebody's spouse, somebody's kids. So these are all like the rules that you think about up front to say, okay, if something happens, what are the mechanics for a buyout? Do we want to explore that? If so, what are the rules? So
it's an interesting point you raised here, Peter. see what happened is, what if somebody has not done in the past, and after listening to this, and they say, "Oh shit, I need to go back and modified it." Can they come back and say, "Listen, can I modify it with all the partners agreeing to this thing and saying that, well, we should take care of all those like retirement, pass away, separation out"? Can they come and modify the contract? I'm sure they can, but I just want to hear from
Yes, that's a great question, Sanjay. And the answer is yes. You could do that at any time. But I would say is the earlier in the relationship you can do it, the better.
Better it is. Okay. Makes sense.
Because for two reasons. Number one is when you're starting out that business relationship, there's no agendas. Nobody's thinking about retiring. Nobody's thinking about leaving, or maybe they are, but it's out on the table. Point is that if you do it early in the relationship when nobody has that agenda, and then they're not, forcing a position on anybody, because they could be on both sides. They could be the one leaving, or they could be the one staying. And so the earlier you do it in the process, typically the more level-headed folks look at it without that agenda. So yeah, and certainly, if you are waiting to. That I always say to folks, in these partnership agreements, if you were to sign a partnership agreement, what typically happens? You put it in a drawer, you never look at it again. Mm-hmm. And the only time you'll look at it is when it's when there's a problem. Mm-hmm. And so you don't want to wait until there's a problem to try to, for the first time, address it. You'd rather try to anticipate those problems well in advance, because when you do take that partnership agreement out of the drawer and look at it, you could say, okay, yes, here's what we agreed to, last year, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever, as opposed to, for the first time, dealing with it, because that's when things spiral to sometimes a bad place. So to answer your question specifically, you could always adjust things. And by the way, not only should you, not only can you always adjust it, but you should periodically take it out out of that drawer once in a while, and sit, have a cup of coffee, and say, okay, is there anything we need to change? Is there anything we need to update? Economics change, the size of the business changes, et cetera. So you want the document to be revisited once in a while rather than be forgotten about.
Yeah, you read my mind, actually. I was going to ask that as a follow-up question, that actually was not really a question, as a statement saying that, well, actually, looking at what you said, I think you should periodically do that, because nothing is stagnant. Things that keep on changing. And so your document should be, and you should review it, but does it require a change or not? So yeah, I think that's good.
No, exactly. Not that I want to give you war story after war story after war story, but as a perfect example, I had clients who many, many, many years ago did the right thing. They signed an operating agreement. They were 50-50 owners. They had a very good operating agreement, 20 years in the past, and they just never took it out. And one of the components of that operating agreement was that they were to get life insurance on one another, and that life insurance would fund a buyout. If somebody passed away, there would be a bucket of money from the proceeds, life insurance proceeds coming in, that would fund a buyout. And so they purposely set a valuation at X dollars, and it tied to the corresponding amount under the life insurance policy. Well, they got 20-year term life insurance. So that 20 years came and went, the policies expired, and they completely forgot about it. And then a handful of years after that, one of the guys passed away. And so now for the first time, the surviving partner took out the operating agreement and said, geez, here's the buyout amount. Oh, and it was supposed to be funded by insurance, which had expired and terminated years before. Yeah. And so they were in a pickle. So you want to revisit that, every so often, so that things like that don't happen, so that things don't go stale and get old and outdated.
Well, makes total sense to me.
Yeah.
Great. So jumping on to the next part of that, I mean, you are a healthcare one also. And like you advise corporate advice to hospitals, as you mentioned, ambulatory surgery centers, physician, professional practitioners and everything, dentists, chiropractors you mentioned. So what can you go in a little bit more transactional part of that? That what really you actually do that, because it's really about the corporate part of it, or it gets into a little bit more of the health related aspects also.
Yeah, I know that's an interesting question because I think it touches on both sides of it. And I say that by meaning a lot of what I do in the healthcare space is your typical corporate documents, but specific to healthcare. For example, if a physician wants to open a new office, the physician's going to need a lease. Well, I would negotiate that office lease. Perhaps they need some bank financing, so they get a set of loan documents. I would review the loan documents. Perhaps they're going to hire a new a physician, and so they'll want an employment agreement with that associate physician. So I would prepare the employment agreement. Point being is that all of those things, the employment agreement, the lease, the loan documents, it's a very similar to the employment agreement, to the loan document, to the office lease in a non-healthcare space. Construct. There are definitely things specific to healthcare and healthcare field that you want to address, but the nuts and the bolts are the same. But there are definitely things that are specific to healthcare that non-healthcare attorneys wouldn't know about. For example, from a regulatory perspective, which is the other side of things, there's the corporate healthcare and then there was regulatory healthcare. From the regulatory perspective, healthcare laws are very complex. There's laws in the healthcare space that address relationships, for example, among physicians and healthcare providers, dealing with referrals. And in the non-healthcare space, for example, a business, I'll give a very simple example. In a non-healthcare business, if party A was to refer a client over to party B might pay party A some sort of referral fee. Hey, you're sending me a client. I'm going to send you a check for, X dollars as a thank you. In the healthcare world, that is a huge issue. In the healthcare world, there's what's called an anti-kickback statute that says you can't do things like that. You cannot pay for referrals. And so there's a whole body of law specific to healthcare that number one, sometimes are not in line with what is, common business sense, I'll say. And number two is very complex, even if it is common business sense. Sometimes it's just so complex you need folks who live and breathe it. So you don't want to go to a typical corporate attorney who has no healthcare experience and have that attorney do stuff in the healthcare area because, he or she may not know what needs to be addressed, things to think about. So yeah, it's a very, challenging, specific area, and the law is always changing. So it just is very specific to healthcare. And I'll say, sort of off topic, Sanjay, a good, one of the first things I always say to new clients is, who's your team? Okay, you're talking to me and coming to me because I'm an attorney, and you're certainly looking for an attorney, but who's your accountant? Who's your insurance agent? Who is your banker and, your banking relationship? Who is your team? Because, when I talk from a corporate perspective or when I talk from a healthcare perspective, sometimes my questions go well beyond the legal side of things. I'll ask about taxes and how, whatever the conversation is, how does that impact taxes? And ultimately you want to loop in an accountant for those type of questions. Oftentimes there's insurance related questions. So you need these folks who specialize as part of the team, to be available.
Makes sense to me. There's one more thing. I was reading about it, like referrals, right?
Yeah.
And what can you talk about that a little? Because I know that you talk about anti-kickback statute, but what about the self-referrals ones?
So I'll talk very broadly. There is a series of federal and state healthcare specific laws, stark and anti-kickback laws on the federal level, and here in New Jersey, the Cody law on the state level, which are kind of the cornerstone of healthcare laws, and these laws touch many types of relationships and business ventures between two parties that go beyond a simple example of me referring a patient to you and whether or not you can pay me for it. And which is an obvious example that we always give and an obvious improper thing to do. But there are many business relationships that touch on these laws that you wouldn't think about. For example, let's say you're a physician and I'm a physician. I have a 10,000 square foot office and I don't need 1,000 square feet. And so you say, hey, I'm going to sublet that's 1,000 square feet from you. So in a non-healthcare setting, two business owners subletting from one another is common practice. No issues. We sit, we talk, we figure out what the sub rent would be, and we have a sublease put in place. End of story. In the healthcare world, for example, I lease in that hypothetical 1,000 square feet to you, and you pay me, making this up, $1,000 for rent. Well, the question is that rent fair market value or not? If that rent is not fair market value, too high or too low, and you and I refer patients back and forth, that could be a disguised way of
commissions and anti-kickback laws.
Exactly. Okay. So that's a very simple but very real example that happens all the time.
Makes sense.
But there are other ways of I'll say another, for example, is compensating one another. Let's say you and I are co-owners of a practice. And how do we compensate one another for our services? And we could do everything equally. We could do everything on some sort of production mechanism in terms of how much are your collections, or how much is your production metrics, things like that. But you have to be careful, because depending on what services we are talking about, doing things, for example, on a production basis may inadvertently trip up on what you're allowed to do. So I'll get into a specific discussion with my doctor and healthcare clients of how do you compensate one another. We want to make sure you're not inadvertently, violating the law. So, that falls under the Stark law. So there's a lot of, and the self-referral law. So there's a lot of questions to be asked or thought about that, as I said a few moments ago, you don't want just a general corporate attorney, for example, asking those questions. They wouldn't know what the answers are. They wouldn't even know what the questions are to begin with. So from that aspect, it's good to have, again, the healthcare attorney, who specializes in it.
This is great conversation. I can keep going on and on and on.
Yeah. Yes. It is a rabbit hole you can go down of
I know. This. I love it.
Scratching. Yeah.
Every time you say something, I'm like, oh my God, I have 15 more questions.
Yes.
But this is interesting. So there are two things I was trying to understand. One is that, one part is like how technology changed the way you are dealing with your customers. Another was like, how the marketing playing a role, or digital marketing playing a role in what you do and reaching out to the customer, educating the customers. And, most of the people don't even know that this kind of attorney exists. I mean, they know that, but they don't know how to reach out, kind of things, or what all things they should see to reach out. So it's a kind of together question, if you will, like one question, technology aspect. I think that has changed since pandemic till now. And then the digital marketing has started playing a very big role. And how is that changing the way you work and your customers should work?
Yeah. So let me start on the first one, is how technology has either impacted or changed things. And two things come to mind very quickly. One is the Zoom, Teams, video technology. I will say pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, I'd have clients for 15, 20 years who I talk to regularly and maybe see face to face, once every 2, 3, 4 years. Could talk once a month, but just don't sit face to face, all too frequent, because there's, really no need from a service perspective.
Okay.
Come COVID and pandemic, a lot of what we attorneys did or do shifted to Zoom, to Teams, etc. And so we oftentimes, instead of having conference calls and phone calls, we'll do, video calls. And I do think that is a very good development over the last, 3, 4 years, because you get to the same end result, which is a conversation. But when you see somebody face to face, and in this case, not physically in the same room, but face to face electronically, it opens up a whole new level of dialogue that really wasn't there from the phone perspective. So from a just interaction perspective, that has been used a lot since COVID. The other thing is a lot of my deals, pre-COVID, I'm not going to say all the time, but often when we did a deal, meaning somebody sold a business, somebody invested in a business, whatever, we'd sit in a room and physically sign documents and close a deal, as they say.
Electronically, I believe.
Exactly. Now everything is moved electronically, which has its pluses and minuses, but it certainly makes it a lot more efficient in the sense that I have deals where I'm in New Jersey, my client is in New York, the other client, or the other party is on the West Coast. You have an attorney down south on the other side, so everybody is physically in different locations. So the what we call a remote closing, electronic closing, where everything is done remotely, electronically, has really, I'll say, helped the process, which means also makes it more efficient, which means it makes it less expensive in terms of an electronic closing as opposed to a physical closing. So I think
expand your reach also, actually, that you can
100%. Yeah, I've got clients in Europe, overseas, all over the place.
Interesting.
That we can, other than the time zone factor, we can very easily communicate and do deals together.
How cool is that?
Yeah, no, it makes it really easy. Exactly. Yeah. The other thing you asked about was marketing and, how things. Yeah. I mean, listen, my 2 or 3 biggest, I'll say, marketing, platforms. One, it is seminars, and 2, it is, articles. I'll give seminars. Sometimes it's to other attorneys. Sometimes it's to a specific industry, but things touching on the corporate or healthcare law or space, and same thing with articles and writing is same, whether it's focused to other attorneys or those in the industry. Do a lot of that. But needless to say, things change quickly from the legal perspective, and it's always good to let your clients or prospective clients and other attorneys know your view on how things are changing. I'll give you 2 examples. The FTC last week came out with a ruling on restrictive covenants. This has been a very hot topic from the lawyer perspective, and depending on your industry, many industries are very focused on it. But the FTC last week just had a ruling that they're essentially barring restrictive covenants for employees. Huge change in terms of how things will be done from a legal perspective. Huge change of how things will be done from a business perspective. So it's just being out on the forefront of that. At the end of last year, a new regulation became effective called the Corporate Transparency Act, CTA, which again is a very system-wide a huge departure from the norm in that now this particular act requires business owners to disclose to the government who their owners were or are. That was not in play before this act. And these are, I'll say, industry-wide, has a huge impact. And it's these types of things, back to what we're talking about, seminars and articles. That's the type of thing that, when these things are rolled out, that's the type of thing I'd be educating, others on.
That is interesting. That is interesting to see the aspect of that. Interesting. Yeah. Seminars and everything are definitely blogs, seminar articles, and all those things definitely are a good source for kind of reaching out and letting people know that how can you help kind of thing. So I'm just trying to close on to our conversation. I just want to thank you for that, but I would like you to talk about how people who are interested in reaching and how they can reach out to you, your contacts, what they do, what they should do.
Yeah. So I will say is that I'm always open to talking to anybody if they have questions. They can reach out to me by phone or by email. Email is typically the best way, and we could set up a time to talk. But either way, I'm always open and interested to talking to whomever about any questions they've got and ways that I can hopefully help them. And I will say at the end, if I can't help them, I'm quite certain somebody in my office can help them. So, welcome anybody reaching out to me.
For sure. So, your telephone number and your email, if you can share that.
Yep. So telephone number is 732-855-6426. That's my direct line, 732-855-6426. My email address, pgreenbaum@willents.com. So it's my first initial last name, P Greenbaum, Green, B-A-U-M, at Willents. My law firm is Willents.com, WILENTZ.com.
Great. Again, thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. This was very engaging. I didn't even realize that we were talking for a while, but thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate that. Thanks.
I thought it was great, Sanjay. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Pioneers in Pixels. We hope the discussion was enlightening and informative, giving you a clearer insight into the complexities. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and never miss an episode. Join host Sanjay K. Katarpal next time for more insights and interviews with leading legal experts. Until then, stay informed and empowered. This has been Pioneers in Pixels. Thank you for listening and have a great day.